Jesus wasn't nice. Jesus was a Mediterranean master of insults. He wasn't the sweet, polite, gentle figure we imagine in parishes and Sunday school. The unknown anonymous evangelist we name Matthew certainly presents Jesus as master of language and insults. From beginning to end, Matthew is a book of insults. This is very much in style with Jesus' agonistic culture. Matthew begins with John the Baptist insulting Pharisees and Sadducees. He calls them snake bastards. So too does Jesus later on. Folks, if you insult someone's parentage in the Middle East, that'll get you murdered. And that explains much about prophets like John and Jesus. The Matthean Jesus can take as well as give. He successfully answers the devil's insulting challenges, and thereby passed his trial by ordeal or honor test. Hence, Jesus emerged from alternate reality as a genuine holy man or Israelite shaman, somebody who can navigate the spirit world without being possessed. Insults are very much on the Matthean Jesus' mind in subsequent chapters. Matthew got a collection of Jesus sayings when he wrote his gospel and edited them together into a fictional sermon taking place on a mythological mountain. And there we hear the Matthean Jesus telling his group to rejoice and be glad when others insult them. The Matthean Jesus group is encouraged to be salty people, meaning catalysts that burn people up. In other words, respond to insults in kind. By the way, salt in the peasant Middle Eastern world of Jesus is about starting fires, not seasoning or preserving food. Matthew constructs his fictional sermon beginning with Jesus insulting Judean scribes. The Matthean Jesus, thought to be a Galilean nothing person, contrasts his interpretation of commandments with those of elite Torah experts. Given Jesus' lowly honor status, this is insulting. In these antitheses, we see the Matthean Jesus hurling insults. But we also read him teach, whoever insults his brother shall be liable to the council. That word the RSV translates as insults literally means whoever says to his brother raka. Raka is Aramaic for imbecile. Next, the Matthean Jesus says, whoever says you fool shall be liable to the Gehenna of fire. Ironically, later on in Matthew, Jesus himself uses this same insult against Pharisees. He calls them blind fools. Is Jesus being inconsistent? Scholars Bruce Molina and John Pilch remind us that the Matthean Jesus, in perfect Middle Eastern form, is comfortable with inconsistency. In this cultural world, the cultural world of the Bible, people say one thing, but mean something completely different. Isn't that just like Jesus? Isn't that what happens whenever people ask Jesus questions? First, he usually responds by insulting them. Next, he tells a story that has nothing to do with what was asked him. Besides that, the parable says one thing, but means something else. Jesus' questioners are left confused and insulted. Ultimately, and very unlike Catholic catechus, Jesus prefers this result. This is normative inconsistency, folks. Like when Jesus forbids an action, no insulting or calling anybody fool, but then later on, it's perfectly acceptable, an excusable strategy in public exchanges. That is so typical of the Middle East. Here, Jesus is being a typical Middle Eastern personality. So, continuing with the fictive sermon on the mythological mountain, Matthew crafts his second part of the sermon as a series of insults. These are explicit insults directed against the Pharisees. The Matthean Jesus uses his favorite insult here, hypocritai, mask-wearing actors. Boy, does Jesus relish this insult. Throughout Matthew, continually, Jesus hurls it against the Pharisees. In Matthew, whether you're literate or illiterate, one thing's for sure, you will be insulted by Jesus. But Jesus gives different insults accordingly. In his day, no more than 10% of the total population was literate. In fact, literate people were probably around only 0.5%. Therefore, illiterate people mostly made up Jesus' audience, and we can assume as much on Matthew's mythical mountain. To them, he says, you have heard, ... And when he insults his illiterate, mostly peasant audience, he scathingly asks, have you not heard? But in contrast, when dealing with literate retainers and elite people, the Matthean Jesus instead asks, have you not read? After the sermon concludes, Matthew details 10 mighty deeds of Jesus. Here we find the story of the humble centurion asking Jesus to heal his servant. The Matthean Jesus replies by insulting his fellow barbarian Israelites. Incidentally, the text nowhere implies that this centurion is a Gentile. Contrary to widespread misunderstanding, there were Israelite centurions. Next, the Matthean Jesus is asleep at the wheel during a storm, so the disciples panic. They understandably wake him up. And what does the Matthean Jesus do? He promptly insults them, calling them men of little faith. This is his favorite insult for his followers. In the Mediterranean Gospels, faith means loyalty. But the cowardly disciples have broken allegiance with God, so they seek help from the broker Jesus. Consequently, Jesus, the shaman, intercedes, and God rescues them from the storm demon. Jesus, master of the insult, just doesn't let up on his disciples. Look how he exhorts them to become like children. He doesn't mean become like American kids, folks. In antiquity, with no way to control infectious disease and sky-high infant mortality rates, childhood was a horrific time. Therefore, be like children is highly insulting. When Pharisees criticized the Matthean Jesus dining with tax collectors and sinners, Jesus strikes back with an insult. This Galilean peasant questions their competence as scripture experts. Outrageously, Jesus instructs them to discover the meaning of the prophet Hosea. Contrary to American Christians who ethnocentrically demand he be a universalist, the Matthean Jesus has no use for Gentiles. Once he consolidates his political faction, he sends his followers out on a mission. Strikingly different from Luke and John, the Matthean Jesus kicks things off by insulting non-Israelites and Samaritans. Go nowhere among the Gentiles. Enter no town of the Samaritans. The Matthean Jesus has no interest at all for Gentiles and Samaritans. Do you know what the absolute worst insult is in the Matthean Jesus repertoire? Calling his stubbornly resistant fellow Israelites Gentiles or tax collectors. Gentile, or its synonym dog, is the worst insult Jesus can give. Keep that in mind. We're going to be returning to that pretty soon. Observe the Matthean Jesus advising his disciples on how to exit an inhospitable place. To shake off the dust from your feet is an insult, even if not verbalized. Then Matthew presents a section of reactions to Jesus and his proclamation. Name-calling and claiming someone has a demon is an insult meant to discredit. So the Matthean Jesus is called a glutton and a drunkard, indicating that he is a rebellious son and therefore he should be destroyed. How does the Matthean Jesus respond? With an insult, of course, this time levied against Capernaum, his adopted hometown. Next up, Jesus unleashes another insult on the scribes and Pharisees. He calls them an evil and adulterous generation. This probably alludes to their breaking the covenant with God in apostasy. The Gospels depict the Pharisees as believing themselves to be perfect models of righteousness and pleasing to God. So imagine the weight behind Jesus' insult here. According to the Matthean Jesus, his parables play a crucial part in his very rude and impolite strategy. In other words, the Matthean Jesus intends to confuse, to obfuscate, using obscure and secretive language, leaving himself open to multiple interpretations, endless confusion. Keep 'em guessing, Jesus. After the Matthean Jesus gets into another verbal brawl with Pharisees over purity issues, he insultingly describes his enemies, calling them blind guides. Okay, so now having gone on this little jaunt through the gospel called Matthew, you should understand by now that the Matthean Jesus is a far cry from the sweet Jesus we present to youngsters in Sunday school. Jesus was not a warm, nice gentleman. Frankly, we would consider his orientation to be rude and excluding. Before leaving this presentation, I would be remiss if I did not bring up the cruelest, most outrageous insult Jesus gave in his career. Matthew chapter 15, verse 21 to 28. And who was the recipient of the cruelest insult Jesus ever gave? A Gentile dog, a foreign woman. Having gone through the entirety of Matthew, like we just did, should this surprise you? First off, when she begs him for help, Jesus ignores the foreign dog. This isn't the United States, folks. In America, strangers of different genders have no problem sitting next to one another at the movies. But the world of the Bible is fiercely gender divided, just like 80% of the world today. In the scriptures, unrelated men and women don't engage socially in public. While that may offend our so-called enlightened American sensibilities, please understand that the Gospels were not written for, by, or about Americans. By ignoring her, the Matthean Jesus is doing something culturally appropriate, but we would be lying if we did not say that it was rude and insulting. And then he ethnocentrically explains his actions. Jesus says, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." The big surprise in this story, of course, is that the foreign woman beats Jesus at his own game of challenge and riposte. After he calls her a dog, she slaps Jesus back with a perfect parry and thrust. This results in the only New Testament episode where Jesus loses an argument. But thankfully, the Matthean Jesus is a good loser. So he grants her the favor and brokers healing for her daughter. My friends, the prophets, both in ancient times and now, had hard messages to give and weren't nice, warm, cuddly figures. Something to think about.